The 1990s were a strange transitional decade for horror, neither fully devoted to the gritty, grimy practical effects of the 1980s, nor yet ready to embrace the digital, heavy, glossy fear machines that would dominate the 2000s. Instead, the horror films of the 90s occupied a bizarre middle ground, filled with well-intentioned weirdness, laughable misfires, misguided sequels, and cult classics that continue to live on in dorm rooms, midnight screenings, and nostalgic rewatches. Horror during this decade was often campy when it meant to be serious, over the top when it tried to be subtle, and, in many cases, charmingly bad, even when aiming for greatness. What these films lacked in polish or coherence, they made up for in memorable lines, ridiculous plots, and a certain VHS-era scrappiness that made them hard to forget. And for horror fans who grew up in the aisles of Blockbuster, clutching plastic clamshells and daring each other to rent the weirdest thing on the shelf, the worst horror movies of the 90s still hold a special, blood-soaked place in our hearts. In 1990, the decade got off to a memorably awful start with the infamous Troll 2, a film that has since become the gold standard of so bad it's good cinema. Despite what the title suggests, Troll 2 is not a sequel to Troll, and in fact contains no trolls at all. What it does have is a group of vegetarian goblins. Yes, goblins. A town called Nilbog, subtle, and some of the most baffling dialogue ever captured on film. The acting feels like a middle school play gone rogue. The effects look like a high school art project. And yet the film somehow manages to entertain from start to finish. The infamous "Oh my God" scene has taken on a life of its own in internet lore, and the entire movie is celebrated in the loving documentary Best Worst Movie, which proves that passion can outlive quality. That same year, Maniac Cop 2 doubled down on the action/slasher hybrid formula, giving us more shootouts, more gore, and even less sense. And then there was The Guardian, directed by The Exorcist's own William Friedkin, in which a malevolent, druidic tree spirit kidnaps babies. Not just a weird detour in Friedkin's career, but a baffling example of how completely off-the-rails horror could go when no one said no. Then came 1991, a year that delivered a few of the decade's most gloriously goofy entries. Popcorn tried to predate Scream with a meta-horror premise set at a horror movie marathon where a killer blends in among the costumed fans. It had all the right ingredients: camp, kills, and movie-within-a-movie fun, but somehow still ended up feeling like a jumbled mess. Still, it earned cult status for trying something new. Meanwhile, Dolly Dearest went the possessed doll route and failed to spark any real scares. It clearly wanted to ride the wave of Child's Play popularity, but with a doll that looked more like a cranky toddler than a murderous entity and a plot that somehow involved ancient Sanzia spirits, it mostly earned confused giggles. And then, of course, there was Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, Wes Craven's beloved Dream Demon's sixth outing, and one of the most bizarre entries in any horror franchise. Released in 1991, this was supposed to be the end of Freddy Krueger, a character who had gone from genuinely terrifying in A Nightmare on Elm Street to full-blown comic book villain. By this film, Freddy was no longer lurking in the shadows. He was cracking dad jokes, appearing in video games, and flying around like Wile E. Coyote with a glove full of puns. It even featured 3D glasses in the final act, a desperate gimmick that somehow made the movie more ridiculous. Cameos from Roseanne and Tom Arnold, plus an awkward performance by Breckenmeyer, cemented Freddy's Dead as the moment the series leaned all the way into self-parody. It wasn't scary, and it barely made sense, but it sure was a ride. It also tried to retroactively give Freddy a tragic backstory involving dream demons and a violent past. But by that point, most audiences were too busy laughing to care. It was a movie so bad that not even a soundtrack by the Goo Goo Dolls could save it. Think about that. Anyway, things didn't get better, just weirder. Sleepstalker, the Sandman's Last Rites, introduced a soft-spoken sand demon who whispers death threats and turns into dust between kills. The pacing was molasses slow, the effects were bargain bin at best, and the film had the nerve to take itself seriously. Horror fans, in contrast, did not. That same year, Dr. Giggles showed up with all the subtlety of a chainsaw. Larry Drake played the titular character, a maniacal dentist who escaped from an asylum and began punishing people with grotesque dental-themed murders. It was a parade of gore, drills, and cringe-worthy one-liners. While definitely aiming for black comedy, it landed more on the side of unintentionally hilarious. Still, it's impossible not to appreciate the sheer commitment to the bit. Dr. Giggles doesn't just drill teeth, he drills expectations into the ground. By the time 1993 rolled around, horror had firmly planted its feet in the land of absurdity, and nothing embodied this better than Ticks. This straight-to-video creature feature starred none other than Alfonso Ribeiro, yes, Carlton from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, as a street, smart, tough-talking teen named Panic. Watching Ribeiro try to shake off his sitcom roots and deliver lines like a hardened youth on the edge was something to behold. The real stars of the show, though, were the grotesque, steroid-mutated ticks that burst out of people's skin in a flurry of goo and shrieks. It was all filmed with a mix of practical effects and sheer audacity. The movie made absolutely no scientific sense. Why were ticks on steroids again? But it delivered exactly the kind of weird, slimy spectacle that the era was known for. That same year, the increasingly confused Amityville franchise trudged on with Amityville: A New Generation, a film that made the executive decision to move the horror out of the iconic house and into a haunted mirror. Gone were the bleeding walls and demonic pigs. Instead, viewers were treated to a cursed piece of antique home decor. The film tried to modernize the franchise by injecting it with urban decay aesthetics and a bit of psychological horror, but by this point, the series was more known for its bizarre twists than for actual scares. A haunted mirror may sound like a bad idea, and it was, but compared to what came later, Looking at You, Haunted Lamp, and Amityville 4, this was practically Shakespeare. In 1995, horror fans were treated to a feast of low-budget insanity, with multiple releases that would go on to be loved, mocked, and memed for decades. Ice Cream Man, starring Clint Howard, Ron Howard's less celebrated but infinitely creepier brother, took suburban horror to new lows, or highs depending on your taste. Howard plays a deranged ice cream vendor who dishes out frozen treats made from his victims. The tone swings wildly from slapstick to slasher, and the gore is as colorful as it is creatively unnecessary. With weirdly cheerful sets, over-the-top acting, and a sense of humor that feels beamed in from another dimension, Ice Cream Man became an instant late-night cult favorite. Watching a grown man in a paper hat chase kids with a blood-soaked scooper is something you can't really prepare for. Then there was The Dentist, another 1995 entry that tapped into the primal fear of sitting in a dental chair. The villain here isn't just any dentist, he's a full-blown psychopath played with icy precision by Corbin Burnson. Scenes of tooth extractions turn into gore fests, with drills, pliers, and very little anesthesia involved. The film's tagline could have been "Open wide and scream." It was gruesome, sleazy, and somehow got a sequel. Also released that year was Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation, a bizarre reboot of sorts that featured Matthew McConaughey with a cybernetic leg and Renee Zellweger in full final girl mode. The film is equal parts incoherent and hypnotic, with McConaughey giving a performance so unhinged it seems to exist in another reality. From government conspiracy theories to random cross-dressing Leatherface scenes, it's a cinematic fever dream that's hard to explain but even harder to forget. As the decade neared its end, the genre began shifting toward teen-centric horror, trying to capture the MTV generation with sleek casts and glossy production. Enter I Know What You Did Last Summer in 1997. On paper, it had all the right ingredients: a cast of television and pop culture darlings, Sarah Michelle Gellar, hot off Buffy, Freddie Prinze Jr. at peak heartthrob status, Jennifer Love Hewitt still doing Party of Five, a murder mystery, and a spooky setting. But the film's execution was uneven, at best. The killer, an angry fisherman wielding a hook, never quite became iconic, and the script felt more like a teen soap opera than a slasher. The emotional stakes were murky, and it all built up to a climax that was somehow both over the top and forgettable. Still, it managed to do well enough at the box office to earn a sequel. That sequel, I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, hit in 1998 and decided that if the first one was lukewarm, the second needed to go full-on tropical chaos. The gang now finds themselves on a storm-ravaged island resort, complete with a karaoke subplot, and a killer who's somehow still dragging that same hook around. The twist? It's somehow even more nonsensical than the original. The tone is all over the place. The scares are few, and the script reads like it was written over a long weekend. It's more comedy of errors than horror, but in that late 90s way, that still feels weirdly charming. Also, in 1997, Jack Frost emerged from the icy depths of straight-to-video hell and immediately confused an entire generation of horror fans. The premise alone was bonkers. A serial killer gets chemically fused with snow during a car crash and becomes a living snowman with a thirst for murder. He stabs people with icicles, slides under doors as a puddle, and even, infamously, commits a bathroom assault scene that has baffled and disturbed viewers ever since. Despite the absurdity, or maybe because of it, the movie found an audience. It was so ridiculous, it became instantly quotable. And yes, it got a sequel. Jack Frost 2, Revenge of the Mutant Killer Snowman, sent the chili killer to a tropical island. No, that doesn't make sense. Yes, it still happened. By the time 1999 rolled around, horror had taken a long, winding detour into self-parody territory. The genre, once defined by gothic atmosphere or raw slasher grit, had begun to openly poke fun at itself, sometimes intentionally, often not. Take The Rage, Carrie 2, for instance. Here was a film that attempted to resurrect the tragic teen horror of Carrie, this time filtered through a new metal post-Scream lens. It was moody in all the wrong ways, completely unnecessary, and oddly obsessed with high school football culture. The telekinetic revenge theme was still there, but now layered with angsty voiceovers, slow-motion tantrums, and a cast that looked like they'd stepped off the set of a WB teen drama. The Rage, Carrie 2 didn't so much honor the original as it did recycle its beats through a Hot Topic clearance rack. Meanwhile, Candyman 3, Day of the Dead, landed with all the grace of a direct-to-video curse. Gone was the eerie, poetic dread that made the original such a standout. In its place were clunky metaphors, wooden performances, and an underwhelming plot set during Dia de los Muertos that felt more like set dressing than meaningful cultural backdrop. It tried to be scary, but mostly came off as confused. Even Tony Todd, as commanding as ever, couldn't save this one from falling into horror sequel purgatory. Throughout the 90s, the direct-to-video market was flooded with horror content from low-budget powerhouses like Full Moon Features and Trauma Entertainment. These studios weren't aiming for prestige. They were aiming for the back shelves of every Blockbuster in America, and they delivered. Puppet Master 4, 5, and 6 all hit during the decade, continuing the saga of murderous marionettes with increasingly bizarre lore. Then, there was Head of the Family, which centered on a literal giant head with psychic powers who runs a crime syndicate. Yes, that really happened. Subspecies and trancers, 3 to 5, carved out their own niches, mixing vampires and time-traveling cops with just enough weirdness to keep horror junkies coming back. Demonic Toys delivered exactly what it promised. Evil playthings running amok in dimly lit warehouses, cackling and slicing their way through throwaway characters. No discussion of 90s horror insanity would be complete without Leprechaun. Released in 1993, it introduced the world to Warwick Davis as a wisecracking, gold-obsessed killer who delivered bad puns with every kill. Against all odds, it became a franchise, one that defied logic, tone, and location. By the time we reached Leprechaun 4 in space, any pretense of fear was gone, replaced with a laser-shooting, rapping leprechaun who would later end up in the hood. And, naturally, back to the hood. The series leaned into its own absurdity and became unforgettable for it. The bargain bin offered even more glorious disasters. Bloody Murder was a shameless knockoff of Friday the 13th, complete with a hockey-masked killer, a summer camp, and a plot held together by sheer willpower and duct tape. Ghoulies Go to College took its tiny monster franchise into academia, which somehow made it even more unhinged. Uncle Sam gave us a reanimated corpse in an American flag who punished unpatriotic citizens in gory fashion. And Tix, yes, Tix deserves another shout-out, featured giant, slimy parasites, and a cast that included a young Alfonso Ribeiro playing a kid named Panic. Every second of it is bonkers in the best way. Looking back, the 1990s horror scene was a spectacular mess, equal parts cringeworthy and comforting. It was a decade where traditional scares gave way to gimmicks, where budgets were tiny and ambitions were huge, and where VHS cases with ridiculous cover art often hid wonderfully awful surprises. There were killer dentists, vengeful dolls, undead mascots, and puppets that committed war crimes. And through it all, the one thing that stayed consistent was the pure, chaotic joy these movies delivered. These weren't films trying to win awards or impress critics. They were made for sleepovers, for late-night rentals, for horror marathons, with friends who appreciated a good scream just as much as a bad script. They've aged terribly, and that's part of their charm. Because when it comes to the worst horror movies of the 90s, the worse they got, the more we love them.
we're here just for you.